Hello students, this is Dr. Martina Hesser, and today we will talk about Northern Europe in the 17th century, and this is part 1 of this chapter. Today we will talk about the Low Countries, and we will begin with Flanders, which is called Belgium today. Without going too much into European politics, we should mention that Emperor Charles V left Spain, the Netherlands, and the American territories to his son Philip II, and Germany to his brother Ferdinand. Charles V was born in the city of Ghent, which is in Flanders, and we see this in yellow on the map. What happened was that the northern areas that we would call the Netherlands today, and that we see here in pink on this map, broke away. The majority of the population was Protestant and despised the Spanish rulers. Spain was traditionally Catholic, so Spanish rule in the Netherlands meant religious oppression. The Dutch Protestants rose up. They formed militia groups and defeated the Spanish occupying forces, while Flanders remained firmly under Spanish rule and therefore Catholic. So let's get started with Flanders, and here with one of the greatest painters of this region, and his name is Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens was born in Siegen in Westphalia in Germany, and a Protestant. Later his mother moves to Antwerp and converts to Catholicism. There he enters the Guild of St. Luke in 1598. He studies in Italy for 10 years, where he enjoys an aristocratic education and turns himself, largely due to his disciplined and amiable character, into an elegant courtier. He returns to Antwerp, where he runs a large studio. In 1609, he becomes court painter to Archduchess Isabella, who is closely related to the Spanish court, the occupying force in Flanders. He received special permission to continue his work in Antwerp rather than moving his studio to Brussels. Rubens starts to immerse himself into elegant society. He married Isabella Brandt, the daughter of a leading Antwerp citizen, the humanist Jan Brandt. Between 1622 and 1626, he produced 21 huge historic allegorical paintings for Maria de' Medici. He was knighted twice, once by Philip IV of Spain, and again by Charles I of England. So his relationship to the political authorities, especially the Spanish, started to paint for them. This is Peter Paul Rubens' elevation of the Cross triptych from 1610 to 1611. Rubens painted the elevation of the Cross after returning to Flanders from Italy. The central panel shows a group of finely muscled men attempting to lift the cross and the seemingly unbearable weight of Christ on the cross. The composition is very dynamic. Christ cuts across the central panel in a diagonal. Rubens uses dynamic color and chiaroscuro boldly, a style that would become more subtle with time. In the left wing, you see a group of women, where he shows us really not just women, but also an outlook into the ages and stages of life. We see the young baby, which is perched against the breast of his mother, the mother standing probably for mature life, while the baby stands for infancy. And behind this first group of women, we see an old lady, which stands for old age. So he interjects little details like that in his paintings all the time. Now here's a close-up of the center panel with this very dynamic diagonal that he creates, and all these muscled bodies that show us that these guys must have spent some time in the gym. So this is clearly something nice to look at for the eye. Visual pleasures what is at the heart of his painting. Now, Rubens shows us here the disembarkation at Marseille, and this is one of the paintings he paints for Marie de Medici. Rubens shows us Marie de Medici as she disembarks a ship, which is usually not particularly graceful for anyone, but yet poses no problem for Rubens. Marie de Medici married King Henry IV of France and comes to France from Italy. She is shown here traveling to her new home. Rubens shows her as she walks down a gangplank. She actually walked up, not down, but that was not dramatic enough for Rubens. He wanted to create a diagonal element. All this occurs while Neptune and his Nereids rise from the sea after having accompanied her. The Nereids in the lower half of the picture illustrate Rubens's beauty ideal, the Rubenesque woman, a full-bodied creature with voluptuous curves, engaged in vivid motion, and usually squirming about. His love for this type of female will go hand in hand with his personal story and a happy turn in his life. And here we are. In 1630, 4 years after the death of his first wife, the 53-year-old Rubens married the 16-year-old Hélène Fourment, who is shown here. Hélène inspired the voluptuous figures in many of his paintings from the 1630s on. In an intimate portrait of hers, Hélène Fourment in a fur coat, also known as het Piltken, which means in English the furlet. Rubens's wife is modeled after classical sculptures here, and here in particular the Venus Pudica type, only in slightly fuller dimension, I might add. He had 3 children with his first wife and 5 with Hélène, and she inspired a very extravagant lifestyle later in his life. Well, a couple of words to this painting. The title and the depiction is obviously sexual because the little furlet refers obviously to female genitalia, right? So here is our artist still very much in love with his young wife, and he shows off her physical attributes to the viewer here. In 1635, Rubens bought an estate outside of Antwerp, the Chateau de Steen, where he spent much of his life. At the end of his life, Rubens was doing very well for himself. He lived in a castle, enjoyed a high status in society, substantial personal fortune, and a young wife and a young family. Now we will talk about Antony van Dyck. Antony van Dyck was a Flemish artist and the favorite pupil of Peter Paul Rubens. He becomes the leading court painter in England. Van Dyck was born to a prosperous couple in Antwerp. His talent was evident very early. He was studying painting with Hendrik van Balen in 1609 and became an independent painter around 1615. He was only 16 years old at the time. He set up his own workshop with his even younger friend Jan Bruegel the Younger. By the age of 15, he was already a highly accomplished artist. Van Dyck was a celebrated portrait artist and was able to charge record prices for his works. He was admitted in the Antwerp Guild of Painters of St. Luke as a free master by February 1618. Rubens referred to the 19-year-old Van Dyck as, quote, the best of my pupils, end of quote. He spends 6 years in Italy, here mostly in Genoa, and develops a courtly manner. He was already representing himself as a figure of consequence, annoying the rather bohemian artist colony in Rome. I will read to you a quote by Bellori about his way of being in the world, and here's the quote. He arrived with the pomp of Xerxes. His behavior was that of a nobleman rather than an ordinary person, and he shone in rich garments, since he was accustomed in the circle of Reubens to noblemen, and being naturally of elevated mind and anxious to make himself distinguished, he therefore wore, as well as silks, a hat with feathers and brooches, gold chains across his chest, and was accompanied by servants." End of quote. Now here we see a self-portrait of Van Dyck that shows him as a spoiled individual with the gold chains that we just mentioned in the quote, with a beautiful sunflower and looking over his right shoulder, in a wonderful dress, so the red shiny garment shows us this is an individual who enjoys wealth and money. Now, let's figure out why he got paid so well for his portraits. And let's look at the portrait of an adolescent aristocrat. And here he is. This is a portrait of Prince Rupert, Count Palatine of the Rhine, who was a noted soldier, admiral, sportsman, colonial governor, and amateur artist during the 17th century. Rupert was the nephew of King Charles I of England. In this painting, he is about 14 years old. Prince Rupert had a varied career. He was a soldier from a young age, fighting against Spain in the Netherlands during the 80 Years' War, and against the Holy Roman Emperor in Germany during the 30 Years' War. After various war campaigns, Rupert returned to England and became a senior British naval commander. Our sitter here is shown leaning against a niche in a wall obscured by a dark green curtain that is carelessly bunched together by the young man's elbow. He looks directly at the viewer. His features are relaxed, almost bordering on boredom. He is dressed in a black suit and carries an elegant weapon on his side, and probably expensive weapon. On the right side behind him, we have an outlook into a lush landscape. Underneath, we see a faithful dog looking up to his master. There is no confusion as to who the master is. He might be only an adolescent, but he is clearly in charge of his devices, actually more than that. He is shown here with an aura of authority that springs from his sense of entitlement. He does indeed have the God-given right to lead, despite his young age. At the same time, he is shown here at great ease. Nothing seems forced. The world order that puts this young man in charge and selected him for a supreme leadership position is not artificial. It comes natural. It is a reflection of the natural order of things, and our young prince plays his part in it seemingly effortlessly. Van Dyck was a master at communicating just that. He was able to capture social class while making it look natural, or maybe even more than that, by making it look attractive. Chief requirement for a portrait artist is, and was, that he would make his sitters look good, otherwise he would have been out of a job before too long. Van Dyck instinctively knows that, and paired with his great ability as an artist, delivers outstanding work in this genre. Now, in 1627, he returns to Antwerp for 5 years. Meanwhile, in England, King Charles I tries to make a name for himself as an art collector. He coaxes Van Dyck to relocate to London. And here we see a portrait that Van Dyck makes for Charles I of England from 1635. Charles I was very short, less than 5 feet tall, which is a challenge for every portraitist. In April of 1632, Van Dyck comes to London and was taken under the wing of the court immediately. He was knighted in July and at the same time receiving a pension of £200 per year as the king's court painter. He was provided with a house on the river. He painted more than 40 portraits of Charles himself, as well as about 30 of Queen Henrietta, his wife. In England, he developed a version of his style which combined a relaxed elegance and ease with an understated authority in his subjects, which was to dominate English portrait painting to the end of the 18th century. In 1638, the king arranged a marriage for him. His bride was Mary, the daughter of Lord Ruthven, and a lady-in-waiting to the queen. In 1641, he traveled to the continent and returned sick. He left 2 daughters, one by his wife, only 10 years old, and another one by his mistress. Both eventually lived in great comfort in Flanders. In this royal portrait, we see a great deal of skill of Van Dyck as a portraitist. Charles I is small, which can pose a problem for a painter. If you put a very small person in an imposing architectural setting, such as a throne room, for example, he will look like a child. Van Dyck decides to use nature as a framing element and shows the king as a hunter. He moves his sitter away from the center of the canvas to divert our attention away from the fact that the king is unusually short. High-heeled boots and a large black hat are added, the latter providing a dark halo for the head. Charles is shown here as the tallest protagonist in the painting. The horse, from which he just dismounted, lowers its head to graze. The servants behind it are pushed back. In addition, Van Dyck frames the figure of the king with the hanging branches, while positioning him at the edge of a hill. A lovely valley opens up on the left, which is visually framed by a body of water. This provides a horizontal emphasis and makes the king look taller. The figure of the king itself makes us look up to him. If we observe our own eyes as they are reading this painting, we notice that we start to look at the king in a tectonic fashion. From the bottom up, we start out at the cream-colored boots, then work our way up the red breeches. For a while, our eyes will be distracted by the brilliantly foreshortened left elbow that sticks out at us. Our confusion is heightened by the choice of fabric in the king's jacket, a silver silk material that provides Van Dyck ample opportunity to display his great skill in painting textures. At last we arrive at the framed face of the sovereign, who looks out at us with great ease and authority. We know he is the king. There is no doubt about that. Anthony Van Dyck also paints Queen Henrietta Maria, King Charles's wife. Van Dyck and his exact contemporary Velázquez were the first painters of preeminent talent to work mainly as court artists. Van Dyck's portraits were flattering to an extent that would help audiences surpass the shortcomings of reality sometimes. When Sophia, Electress of Hanover, first met Queen Henrietta Maria in exile in Holland in 1641, she wrote, quote, "Van Dyck's handsome portraits had given me so fine an idea of the beauty of all English ladies that I was surprised to find that the queen, who looked so fine in painting, was a small woman raised up on her chair, with long skinny arms and teeth like defense works projecting from her mouth." End of quote. Here the queen is accompanied by a member of her staff, Sir Geoffrey Hudson, a court dwarf. We know that Henrietta, who was herself a French princess and Catholic, was thoroughly unhappy in England. She had an insatiable hunger for luxury and craved material possessions as well as the company of a large staff. She was very fond of her collection of exotic animals, some of which accompanied her at all times. In this picture, we see Sir Geoffrey Hudson carrying around a monkey. His great success compelled Van Dyck to maintain a large workshop in London, a studio which was to become virtually a production line for portraits. According to a visitor to his studio, he usually only made a drawing on paper, which was then enlarged onto canvas by an assistant. He then painted the head himself. The clothes were left at the studio and often sent out to specialists. An important pioneer in the field of still life painting was Clara Peters. She is the only Flemish woman known to have specialized in such pictures as early as the first decade of the 17th century. Definite details about her life are scarce. Records indicate that Peters was baptized in Antwerp in 1594 and that she was married there in 1639. There is no indication that Peters ever joined the Antwerp Painters Guild. Her earliest dated oil paintings from 1607 to 1608 are all small scale, detailed images representing food and beverages. The skill with which this 14-year-old artist executed such pictures indicates that she must have been trained by a master painter. By 1612, the year of this painting here, the 18-year-old artist was producing large numbers of painstakingly rendered still lifes, typically displaying a group of valued objects, such as elaborately decorated metal goblets, gold coins, exotic flowers, etc. Usually these objects are displayed on a narrow ledge as seen from a low vantage point against a dark black background or dark background. In closing, I would like to emphasize a number of tendencies that we were able to observe in this lecture on Flemish art in the 17th century. We discussed two artists who did very well for themselves. One was Peter Paul Rubens, the other one was Anthony Van Dyck. They were mainly painting for the class of rulers that were connected to the Spanish court, or sometimes they went abroad to courts of foreign countries, or they were painting for the Catholic Church. So both of these types of patrons were vital for the success of these two painters, as we know. We don't know too much about Clara Peters' patronage, but in general we can say that Flemish painters in the 17th century, because they have access to the Catholic Church, who is a potent patron financially, and to the aristocracy that is linked to the royal houses of Europe, are doing usually pretty well for themselves and are quite successful economically. The story is entirely different when we will go to the Netherlands and look at Dutch painting, which we will do in our next lecture. Thank you very much.